Carol Cadou. I have the honor and privilege of serving as the director and CEO of Winterthur Museum, just outside of Wilmington, Delaware. I'm delighted to welcome you to Chandler Farm today and to also tell you a little bit of the history of Winterthur that is embedded in Chandler Farm. Mr. Dupont said that the greatest story of Winterthur was that it told the story of the American people. And we might today look back on the Duponts and the resources that they had and think that they were immune from knowing some of the struggles of the average American. But privilege and wealth certainly can't exempt you from any of the hardships of health or of accident. And certainly Mr. Dupont and his younger sister were tragically left without their mother at an early age. Certainly, the Spanish influenza of 1918 ravaged Winterthur in the same way that it did across the United States. But I think that this also gave Mr. Dupont a sense of resilience. And certainly, we see that resilience represented in the way in which he transformed Winterthur with the help of his father over the course of several decades in terms of not only its building and its expansions, but also in terms of making it a very well-known breeder of Holstein Friesian cattle. And what's really interesting is that Mr. Dupont paid more for one of his bulls, his prize bulls, of an amount that actually is greater than any charge or any cost of any of his very fine decorative arts.
It's interesting to note that Mr. Dupont was always most, his fame was his fame was animal husbandry, but he decided to start the decorative arts collection and museum as an adjunct to his interests. He considered himself a gardener, a collector, and a keeper of cows, if you will, and had one of the finest herds in the world. And that parody of using his intellect and also his native eye really makes Winterthur a very wonderful place.
He did have an epiphany in seeing once when he went to Shelburne Farms in order to look actually at their herd. He had the occasion to go to the home of Electra Havemeyer Webb, who had been influenced by the Colonial Revival to collect Americana. And he says that when he went up and looked at a pine cupboard that was furnished across it with some pink Staffordshire, it almost took his breath away. And from that moment on, he wanted to collect objects from all the different cultures that made America such a wonderful melting pot, bring that to Winterthur and tell these deep stories of the American people as they could be seen through the objects. And so at this point, he mounts a huge campaign to expand Winterthur into what is today over 175 rooms of furnished interiors. And he not only brought the objects, but he went and looked at buildings that were either abandoned or were threatening their preservation. And he brought that authenticity to Winterthur by taking those elements from those buildings, purchasing them, bringing them to Winterthur. And in the case of the Georgia dining room, then you have the original Georgia interior from a home in Georgia. This is very similar to what we see other Americans doing in trying to create these authentic interiors during the Colonial Revival period. In Mr. Dupont's case, though, he had the luxury, for instance, of a badminton court that he was able to bring whole facades from different homes, whether it was North Carolina, the Delaware Valley, the Connecticut River Valley, or Pennsylvania, to bring that sort of immersive experience that today we would say is more virtual reality, but in the 20s and 30s, this is their version of virtual reality. What was so interesting is that as Mr. Dupont progressed, he brought balance and symmetry to all of these interiors. And some of those that are most known today, for instance, the Port Royal Parlor, where he combined the historic architecture with his own sense of design in symmetry and in aesthetic, creating interiors that today represent not only history and the highest form of American craftsmanship, but also have that terrific sense of design that he brought to it. One of the things that was very important to him was bringing the outside and the inside together too.
I think Mr. Dupont's genius was that he had an eye for beauty and he loved history. And that's often a rare combination where an historian is also an aesthete in a very broad way. And I think that's why he loved animals, and that's why he loved the garden, and in the end, that's why he loved the decorative arts, was beauty, which he used as a vehicle to communicate history. He once said he wanted to preserve a country place so people would know about the agrarian life and about traditional beauty. And I think he really triumphed at that.
He also is very influenced by color. And he said that color is everything. And we see that in his gardens as well as in his interiors, and the way he brought those two together, so that visitors today can walk his azalea woods and see all of those specimens that he collected, some specimens that you don't see anywhere else in the United States today that he brought from China and places far away.
He wanted to have every representative azalea for botanical reasons, and then he arranged them to look beautiful by color. So the collection was intellectual and aesthetic. I love that parody. Didn't he famously arrange some fall azaleas in a certain way because it looked chic? You know, you need a little chic, he said. And that word's probably overused, but in his time, it was a rare use of word. But the idea that he would make a museum that was chic is almost anathema today, because we must be serious and we must abide by the.
That's true. And I think the phrase that he used is, to make it look really swell, we have to chic it up.
Yes.
So as you're certainly words that today you wouldn't think about someone using in the 1920s or 1930s.
Not about something serious.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. I think one of the interesting things is the way in which Mr. Dupont was able to blend the outdoor and the in. And this was something that when I took the helm at Winterthur, I was hoping we might be able to do with Chandler Farm. I was also hoping that this residence that had been used by the first director and had been appointed by Mr. Dupont as the director's residence in 1958 could not only recapture some of the history of Winterthur and Mr. Dupont, but also bring us up to date with some of the ways in which we would think today about traditional design informing contemporary design and informing also the way we live with families and in a modern world. And one of the challenges that I had is that there are very few people that can do that. But fortunately, Mr. Dupont established in 1952 a program that would continue the study of his collection and early American decorative arts and early American culture. And one of the illustrious graduates of that program, Thomas Jayne, is world-renowned for being able to blend the contemporary with the historic design and create interiors for modern families. And so I was very delighted when I reached out to Thomas and he agreed that he would help with Chandler Farm.
Carol, we have to also establish that you were a graduate of the Winterthur program also, so we were already trained in a similar point of view, and that really helped. And I really wanted to do something for Winterthur because, of course, the graduate fellowship was extremely generous and has deeply shaped my life. And also, I felt your directorship was really important because you were not treating Winterthur superficially, meaning that you wanted to maintain the historic beauty, but at the same time, there's some very important work you're doing with the infrastructure, the internet, the power, you know, keeping just taking care of the grounds and the trees, all these things that, you know, as a decorator, I understand you don't get any credit for because it's all superficial, but it's not what people see. And I've had many clients disappointed that the construction took so long and the and then happy that a day later when I put the decorations in, it looks so wonderful. So at Chandler Farm, we had a joint agenda, meaning we needed to make a house that was very workable for both your family and also the official business you conduct there, and also communicated Winterthur's message that tradition is now, that we're living with an active tradition. Not, it wasn't then, it's now, and that living with old things gives us stories and also gives us tremendous beauty. Just like Mr. Dupont intoned, he wanted things to be beautiful, but he wanted them to be instructive and informative at the same time. And I think Chandler Farm manages to do that. We found the house, it was in nice condition. It had been taken care of, but it had tenants for 10 years because the directors that preceded Carol had houses in Wilmington. So the house was let out, and it did need a refresh when we got there, but an appropriate refresh, meaning we didn't want to use too many resources to make it look good. And I was able to take the budget, and with Jayne Design Studio's influence and effort, we were able to extend it a great deal. And you can see from the stair hall what the house generally looked like. It had been recently, the most recent full decoration was in the 80s. And I love this picture of the sort of 80s wallpaper going up the stair. And that you can tell they really cared about what they were doing, because you can see the grill at the base, at the floor, that's been faux painted with flowers to tone it in. And I just think that detail proved a lot of love for the house. In our case, we chose to use the stair hall as a teaching tool as much as a piece of decoration. And Carol had suggested pictures of Winterthur on the stair that could tell the story of Winterthur. She said, I want to stand on the first step and be able to tell a group about the history of Winterthur via pictures and images. And of course, as a decorator, I realized that that's an awful lot of picture frames, and it's going to be. And I was remember how people take family photographs and try to put them in their hall, and they're always crooked and hard to arrange. I was like, I had fear. So I thought of the idea of a print room, which is an 18th century. Carol, you know more history about the print rooms, but.
And I think it was fun because it was bringing whimsy, and I think it was a very creative idea. Actually much more cost effective than an expensive framing project, to take photos from the archives telling Winterthur's history, to introduce those with fun little prints. And at the same time, it harkens back to those wonderful 18th century print rooms that women created very, very carefully and curated them to tell their own stories in the 18th century. So it was a beautiful blending, a very creative idea and innovative.
I think it's a great example of lots that happens at Winterthur as a team. Mr. Dupont had, lots of professional help, but he was the mastermind, and the print room was a great example of Carol's idea, and then how we furthered it. And then my husband, who's a great stylist, organized all the prints and made them the right size. And our friend Simon Blake in New Orleans figured out how to make the prints digitally. So it's a very 21st century application, and a great team that came together to make it all work. And I think from the archivist who pulled the prints to Rick putting them on the wall and the great paper hanger putting it up, it was just one of those great corporate stories that I think resonated at Winterthur. And the hall really does introduce the living room, which is a great family space. Almost every time I go there, there's children in the room. So it's not a precious room that no one goes into. And I advocate all the time that we don't need a room so dressy that you can't have a pizza parlor in it, a pizza party in it, as I say. But at the same time, when you want to get dressed up, it looks good. And Carol's had some dress up occasions there and some wild family parties, as I understand. But we did have the great happiness in February to have the Dallas Garden Club to Winterthur, and the program director is our friend Catherine Seal, and her family has a long association with Winterthur. Bill Seal wrote the history of the White House and has given his papers to Winterthur, and this was a celebration. And so we had 50 august ladies from Dallas in the house, and it was so convivial. You know, it had a dressiness, but it also had a really comfortable feeling, and everyone just felt really happy to be there. And I think that is a huge success, that we can make a place full of beautiful old things that still creates comfort.
I think that is one of the beauties, especially of the living room. It brings the aesthetic of Mr. Dupont in thinking about the way in which we are combining different colors. We are thinking about the placement. We even included some of the deaccessioned pieces that he had collected in the 1950s and the 1960s to give it a little bit of a touch of him, but also the contemporary. And I think looking at the way in which Thomas was not only able to just blend more modern things, but also those items that made it, gave it the contemporary feel and contemporary artwork. We didn't have any contemporary artwork in our possession. And one of the ways that Thomas had, I think, a brilliant idea to bring in the very, very well-known photographer, Larry Lederman.
He photographed the estate for 3 days, and the great picture of the sofa of the garden with the barn sort of riding on it like a wave is extremely beautiful. And it also brings in the garden view into the house. I think a great example of Mr. Dupont's tradition of using color and telling a story is the carpet in the living room. When we started the project, Carol showed me the carpet and explained that she had bought it in the Grand Bazaar in Turkey. And I thought that was a great story. She said, you don't have to use it, or we can use it upstairs if you don't want to. And I thought, no, this is going to be the living room carpet. And it's a color scheme that's not particularly popular right now. It's purple or red and green, but they were colors that Mr. Dupont loved. And in effect, the room has an old-fashioned color scheme of pink and then the white curtains to sort of soften it. And it all speaks to Mr. Dupont's taste. The swags and jabots would be very familiar to him and I think endorsed. The colors would please him. The combination of objects, even the purple hurricanes that sit on the mantle were a nod to Mr. Dupont's interest in color and the relationships. So we have a room that's very beautiful intuitively, and we also have one that's really engaging intellectually, because Carol can point to almost every object in the room and it tells a story. A few things interjected by Jayne Design Studio, such as the coffee table with the printed blue and white paper that was scanned from the image was scanned from the collection and then repeated on the bookcase is a contemporary thing that gives it some personal narrative, but very, very proud of the collective whole, and such a demonstration that a young family can exist happily, if not gainfully, with the antique.
And as Thomas said, we do have lots of family parties. We have Friday family night, usually every night in the living room, and enjoy using it for everything from chess and puzzles to a variety of different board games. One of the things, pardon me.
I was going to tell about the dining room.
Yes, and as we go to the dining room too, I just want to point out too, Thomas, the way in which you were able to incorporate Mr. Dupont's lighting aesthetic, and going through the collection for a whole morning, looking at all of the lighting fixtures. We were able to bring those to the first floor spaces, including the view from the living room going into the dining room.
I think I have a pair right behind me on the screen. Thank you, Carol, for your present.
Welcome.
So the one sconce we found I particularly liked was a candle sconce that had an oak leaf on the top, and we were able to replicate that for the collection, and you can see them in the print hall or the stair hall, and that it's sometimes great when a object can literally be reproduced and put into a contemporary use. But the dining room, as you can see, was originally painted, when we found it, was painted pea green that was popular in the 18th century. It's a dense color and handsome, but we thought that it could be more lively in this iteration of the house. And we were working carefully on the schemes, and we had the historic papers out, and William Cullum in my office pulled out the chintz paper that's on the walls now and said, how about this? And I must say, it took me a week or two to get my head around using something so strong and ornate in the house, but it really has a verve, and it makes the room special and memorable. And you have to remember, this room is mostly a nighttime room. So it's lit by candles usually. So it's quieter at night and more enveloping. And a young family story. So one night I was working at the house and I didn't want to go out to dinner because I had more work to do. So Carol, I said, let's order Chinese food. So we ordered Chinese food, and it arrived, and we were in the dining room eating off Chinese export porcelain. And I thought we needed some background music. So I said, Alexa, play Chinese restaurant music. And on it came. And it was just this great sort of transportive thing of ancient, for me, again, a story of ancient and modern. Here we were in this historic house with two children that were awfully interested in Chinese food. And we were having a really wonderful time. And I'm proud of that fusion, if you will. It was definitely cultural fusion, if not appropriate.
Definitely was. It definitely was. And I think that room is one of our favorites. And on nights when we don't order out and have special guests, we often eat in the kitchen, which was when we first walked into it. Thomas and I encountered a very straightforward 1958 kitchen.
Which
and it
preserved because it was so interesting historically. We got to save this. This is really interesting.
Yeah. And the initial was to save it. And then we realized that it would cost much more to save the 1958 than to actually go forward with some more modern cabinetry.
And also, it wasn't functional because of all the entertaining you do. The kitchen just would not handle the audience that you have. So there was a real,
And today it looks very bright and light. And you might recall from the early pictures of Chandler Farm, one of the things that was so challenging is that the whole house was surrounded by very large, very tall evergreen trees that completely enveloped it. And I think it's particularly seen in the kitchen, where formerly the kitchen windows were blocked by these evergreens. It now is a very light, uplifting space, and a place that we love sitting around a table that has some of our own chairs from our grandparents' house, but at the same time is that wonderful blending with the modern that Mr. Dupont favored. And even on occasion, Mr. Bear makes an appearance.
Yeah. And that was another great team effort because Sandy Brown was working on the project, and she had happily done lots of kitchens of this nature. So she was able to mastermind it in an incredibly economical way. But what I really like is the room doesn't jump. It fits into the sequence. So the dining room doors literally open onto that room. And I like the parody where the whole house blends as one. And we all talk about open plans now. And essentially, it's a discrete open plan in that way. And I guess that's why we made an effort on the curtains and all, so that it would look in the yellow stool. So it really interwove all the rooms. And I think that's really important, that the whole greater context is understood, not just the individual pieces. And that's why we fixed the kitchen, because it was a piece that didn't work perfectly. So we never rely on the antique when it doesn't. We always give functionality primacy when we're planning and decorating, and then sometimes we do something impractical out of sentiment, but we do that with great reservation.
I think the kitchen area also and the entire first floor flow very nicely in the way in which it's currently arranged to the outdoors, and the ability to go outside on the screened-in porch and look out to the landscape. When we first encountered the outdoors, and on a very hot day when Thomas was looking out there at all the shrubbery, et cetera, it seemed almost impossible to re-envision it. But by taking down the very long hedge that separated the property from the rolling landscape behind and the view to Chandler Woods, and then also taking out the immediate plantings, which will be replanted with some of Mr. Dupont's favorite species in the early spring, you have opened up a wonderful landscape view.
That's just a great example of restoring something to its original appearance, really uplifts it, because that house did not have plantings dead next to it when it was conceived by Mr. Dupont and Mr. Montgomery. And that hedge had grown up over the last 25 years to a height that wasn't suitable for the landscape. So literally what you've done, Carol, is restore the landscape and make us see Winterthur both historically and for the future.
Well, it's been a great honor to be able to work with you on the project and to see your vision, and certainly the landscape and the way in which it interacts with the interiors is not only something very dear to Mr. Dupont's heart, but something that we see continuing on today at Winterthur in many ways.
Well, you've been a real trooper, and your husband, we have to thank him, because we were out to dinner one night and he says, "What color have you painted my living room?" And I had to say, "Pink." He said, "Pink, I mean it's butch pink." And he was really good. Like he decided that he could withstand a pink living room. And you can see that with the decoration, it's not so pink, but it's just a great story of how you were willing to be experimental, if you will. The print room was a risk, the pink was a risk, the loud wallpaper was a risk, but you were accepting, and I think the net result has been so good, and it shows a great vision for Winterthur.
Well, thanks. I think it just demonstrates that you need to take some risks and trust people and open your eyes to a different way. So thank you for bringing that to Winterthur.
That's great.
I believe there was a question about grand millennial style, but I didn't see it.
I can read it to you. The question is from Ms. McCurdy. Do you think that what is coined grand millennial style, is it real or just wishful thinking? Is there more interest among young people for antiques, or the word that we dread, brown furniture?
I do think there's more interest in old things. I think it is part of that interesting craft and handmade and real materials, which is carrying over to the antique. So I do think people want to have a story behind what they have and not just have it be generic. And that can easily be filled with an antique. I don't think there's any millennial that wants to have a house that's absolutely all antique. So I think it's a balance. And I think people put their, if you put a needle towards really grand to from grand to really grand, I think there's a lot of in between. But I must say that a lot of almost all the brown furniture that's put up at auction, it sells, it has a buyer. So it might not sell for 1980s prices, but there are people buying it. So it's going somewhere, which I think is encouraging.
And to that end, not American, but there was a furniture auction at Christie's in London, which I saw recently, where everything seemed to go either well within or above the estimate, and it was all antique furniture, which is very hopeful for all of our dealers and our colleagues working in the field.
I think once we take I think a lot of hot tours was put around antiques, and people got afraid of them because we were always told not to break them and be careful with them, and once that was eroded somewhat, I think people felt more comfortable. I think there's a lot of work to do though before we get back to we're doing a lot of good stuff. That my colleague who's 32 is deeply steeped in old furniture, and he loves it very, very much, and he has a circle of friends that equally love it. So I think when aesthetic young people start collecting and using it, that it's going to have a revert in time.
And it's certainly a good environmental choice, and certainly is much stronger, much more durable than the younger growth trees that are being felled or the materials that are being put together. It also is very interesting, and I wonder if it's a correlation also with what we're seeing in museums, is that there's a lot of data to show that there's an interest in the authentic, and being able to see something that is a piece of history. And so that might also play into it.
I think that's totally true. And there's also a lot of disappointment in new furniture. You know, a lot of people have bought things from retail outlets, you know, national chain stores, and they don't last. I mean, you pay good money for something, and you maybe get 3 or 4 years out of it, and that by the time you get to your second phase of decorating, you want things that aren't going to erode and go into the dumpster so fast. And so many children had dorm rooms furnished with IKEA, so they've already had that lesson once, or you know, and then maybe their first apartment. But I think most people are glad they don't have to go there anymore when they get to be a little older.
Yeah, the question is, how did Winterthur acquire the property?
That is a very excellent question. One of the ways that we see Winterthur growing is that it was, there were many different contiguous farms that were adjoining the Winterthur property. And Mr. Dupont and his father started buying up those farms. In terms of Chandler Farm, and that includes a vast area that is now today a golf course, Mr. Dupont wanted to have a golf course here at Winterthur, and he wanted to purchase Chandler Farm to extend his property to enable the construction of that golf course. So he purchased the property from Mr. Chandler, the last one living here, and he was quite old at the time, not old by today's standards, but I think that he was in his late 80s, something like this. Unfortunately, in giving him a life tenancy in the property until he started his golf course, Mr. Dupont had to wait a little bit longer because Mr. Chandler was very hardy and had a very long, good life. At that juncture, Mr. Dupont started building his golf course and bringing down architects to make that happen. And we still, today, it's used as a golf course. The golf course is leased to a private club here in Wilmington, and some of the rents that we receive there assist with some of Winterthur's annual operating costs.
But there was a family house in the middle of it all that started Winterthur. It was you know, one house on about 20 acres, I think. That was the nucleus, and then the family acquired the contiguous farms. So the family bought that property in the 19th century, early in the 19th century.
Thank you.
If I can just comment, I really like Mr. O'Brien's comment that in mixing old and new, if you're not forced to purchase all of your furniture at once, and to have things from grandparents or parents, which to us, that's what our house is filled with, provides those stories and is also an enormous cost-saving measure. So I think that's another reason to think about mixing and blending for first homes or first apartments.
And it encourages you to buy things that are inheritable. If things are solid, they can make the next generation. So I think that's pretty important too.
So we have another, Michael Phillips has just joined. He said, I'm a millennial and my house is full of antiques. I could not agree more with the idea that antiques are durable, lasting, and environmentally friendly. Carol, what are your thoughts on antiques that inspire stories and conversation in an interior?
Well, I think that they not only will inspire you to share a little bit of your history or a little bit of who you are with others, but it also is a wonderful reminder. And for instance, I'm seeing here the painting that's above the fireplace that was painted by Aunt Lucy Kettlewell, who was an artist in our family. Certainly it provides a touch point for talking about artists in your family or giving people a little bit more of a clue into you in your personal space. But I think it also just is incredibly meaningful to be surrounded by objects that through which you can remember the stories.
I think we have another question from, what are the museum's plans for the cottage where the gift shop is currently or was housed?
Yes, the cottage, and what we should say is when Mr. Dupont in 1951 opened up Winterthur to the public as a museum, he and his wife moved to a cottage that had been constructed based on designs by Thomas Waterman, the very well-known architect, as well as some of the historic architecture that had come from a house that they had in Southampton. The cottage is remarkable today in its architecture, and it's also very close to the core of Winterthur. We recently decided on the advice of experts, but also our own experience to consolidate retail into one location where visitors come in and out. And I think that this opens the possibility of taking some of the interiors that were enjoyed by the Duponts and sharing them with others in a variety of ways, whether it's interpreting and having tours in those spaces, whether it is allowing events to take place in those spaces. It's going to give us an opportunity to tell a different Dupont story right in the middle of the core of the museum property. And we're just evaluating all the different options as well as a timeline. This isn't exactly the time that you want to invest in a large restoration project, but we certainly will refresh it to the best of our ability right now.
There was, when we were talking about everything, you brought up a really kind of a magnificent photo. And I thought, if with your permission, I would share it with everyone. It was Mr. Dupont in the White House, and you had kind of a great story behind it. Would you mind if I shared that with everyone and you could talk a little bit about his kind of his relationship? Can you all see this fabulous photo?
This is a wonderful photo. I think what you see here also is Mr. Dupont, who is looking at Mrs. Kennedy. She is the First Lady. And one of the things that she wanted was to have the White House serve as a showcase, if you will, for American history, for American decorative arts. And she knew that Mr. Dupont was the icon of the field and asked for his help after she visited Winterthur to see him. And he became the chairman of the Fine Arts Committee. I think that there's a wonderful tie-in here as we think about the redecoration of the White House. We can also think about the founding of the Winter Show as a benefit for the East Side House. And I think, Thomas, you are able to make some of those wonderful connections too with some of the people in the photo.
A lot of the people in the photograph probably went to the Winter Antique Show. There's Mrs. Paley, there's Babe Paley. Obviously, Mrs. Kennedy or Mrs. Onassis came to the show. Jane Engelhardt, Mr. Dupont attended, and it was core to their social life as much as their aesthetic life to participate. And Mrs. Kennedy really wanted to restore a sense of history to the White House, and her idea was that to bring back as many original objects as possible into the decoration so that they would reference that history. And toward that end, she made the ground floor of the White House a national monument, and therefore each president can't sell off that furniture or change it. They have complete prerogative in the private quarters, but the public rooms are actually taken care of by the Committee for the Preservation of the White House, which Winterthur has strong connections with, and the National Park Service. But it's just wonderful to see just the objects, the great federal sofa that they're sitting on, and the vase is a Tupperware vase, which I think Mr. Dupont gave to the White House. It was porcelain made in the Pennsylvania region.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. We have another question, which is a very interesting one. If you were to recommend 5 or so books on decorating, and I would also maybe I'd add to this question from a historical standpoint, the millennials in the audience, what would they be? What would be 5 books that you would recommend on decorating for the millennials?
I would recommend The Decoration of Houses, with the caveat that it's a really hard book to read, and you have to treat it in sections. And when I wrote my book about it, it was really hard. I never said I was like reading the Bible. It was like really dense, and you couldn't just sit down and read it cover to cover. But chapter by chapter analysis is good. And then Peter Thornton wrote a great book called Authentic Decor, where he showed pictures of period paintings of rooms and annotated them with little historic chapters in the beginning. I think that's a great way to learn when you're looking at an actual picture. And then, it helps to read a really solid architectural history, like just so that you have something to append the decoration to. I don't know, Carol, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. And love the Authentic Decor by Peter Thornton, especially the watercolors there. You can get a good idea of what the interiors look like.
Yeah.
I think the grounding in architecture is a very, very good point, because if you can understand some of those architectural styles, and you can find any number of books at Barnes and Noble or any other bookstores that will give you an idea of an overview of American architecture. To try to understand that chronology will give you a good foundation for understanding the furniture, because the furniture is made for those types of interiors, whether they are lower ceilings, higher ceilings, and the way in which they're furnished.
One of my friends I told her that she knew about paintings, but not decoration or architecture. I said, if you think about the history of art in terms of paintings or fine arts, there's interesting parallels with decor art, so you can tie it together really well that way. So I think, knowledge of art history and architectural history informs the history of decoration. And then there's not one book, but the great tastemakers like Elsie de Wolfe and Dorothy Draper and Albert Hadley, and some of the great decorators of Mark Hampton's book. Reading those books and cumulatively, I think, gives you a good sense of decoration. And I think not so much from a book, but if you know someone, or you have the opportunity to know someone with a handsome interior, to talk about how they formed it, it's really, that is probably the best instruction you can get. But not all of us get to know someone with a great house or a great interior. So of course, books can fill that void.
I just received another question, but via email. This question is for Carol, still on the topic of books. Carol, when you moved, were there books that you looked to for inspiration when you thought about making Chandler Farm your home?
That's a very interesting question. In terms of books that I looked to when I was trying to figure out how to blend things, of course, I looked at Thomas Jayne's books, I think The Finest Rooms in America. Also looking at his American decoration, he's holding up a third book here.
Classical Principles.
Classical Principles.
And it's because so there's Edith Wharton and there's me. Perfect. My publisher did it all.
It's a wonderful book. And I think what I realized is that our home was going to be certainly have a very, very public face. And there were all the first floor rooms needed to represent Winterthur, as well as a guest suite upstairs for different VIPs who would come and stay overnight. But that to make it human, it needed to have that blending. And so in addition to really looking at some of Thomas's books, what I looked at for inspiration, quite honestly, were old Winterthur publications so that I could try to understand what Mr. Dupont's aesthetic was. And there was a book called Winterthur.
In all seasons, I think.
Yes.
Yes.
And then there was one by not John Sweeney.
Yes.
Yeah. Pardon?
I think it was by John.
Was it by John Sweeney? Yeah. And just looking at those pictures of those older interiors was very, very instructive.
Dupont was still alive, and you could see his arrangement, his eye for arrangement. I think, very cute.
Well, you all have given us some wonderful questions and wonderful things to think about.
Well, thank you all so much, Thomas and Carol, and all of you that are joining us for the cocktail session.
There's more pictures of the house on my website. If people want to see more, I realize we didn't illustrate every aspect, but if you go on the Jayne Design Studio website, one can see a fuller arrangement of Chandler Farm, and that nice story in the New York Times about it too.
It was a great story, and last week too, in Arts and the Antique Weekly had a great story as well.
True, and I want to, as we close, I drove through the Bronx yesterday, and it was cold, and it was pretty empty, and I really thought of the children at the Selman House, and so glad we can do this to support them.
Well, it really means the world to us, and Carol and Thomas, thank you both so much. And Eastside House is tremendously grateful as well. You've both been huge supporters of not only the fair, but of Eastside House Settlement, and kind of helping to continue the tradition of scholarship and helping educate the next generation, both Winterthur and Thomas, with you kind of helping to mentor young designers, and obviously the work that you've been doing specifically to help us raise awareness for all of Eastside House's fantastic outreach. So thank you all so much for joining us. I hope this is a wonderful start to your weekend.
Getting for the show too.
You what?
And for the show.
And for the show, and for Eastside House. And thank you so much for continuing the tradition of supporting the very worthy work. We're sorry that tonight we're not going to see all the Eastside House folks dressed up, and that's a very special time to see them present for the show. But next year in person, right?
You really rallied it, Helen, and we're grateful for that.
Well, I'm truly grateful to the two of you and to your teams for helping get this underway, and to all of those that have attended today. Thank you very much. We encourage you to visit the show, which is now open to the public, and to peruse. There's a lot to be seen, and there's there are other opportunities to learn also through those sites. Many of our exhibitors have included some interesting video and other elements of deeper information, so that you can really sink your teeth into it. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and we're looking forward to welcoming you all in person next year.
Yes.
We'll look forward to that.
Thank you.
Stay well, everyone.
Stay well.